back to this part 2 of my TDR2 build series. It's been quite a while since I made the first video, so actually excited to finally get to this stage. The big thing for me was actually getting the electronics, so I finally got all my cyclic servos and my tail servos. So if I just pick up where I left off last time, the last thing I actually did was I installed these mounts, and I didn't have the tail servo at that stage, so I finally got my tail servo, and the servo I decided on was the Futaba BLS276SV. The reason for it is that there's a thread running on the TDR2 and what electronics, what servos people are using on it, and this seemed to be one of the choices that people go with most often. So I read up about the servo. It looks to be a great servo. And on top of it, it's also a programmable servo, so something new for me to learn, because I haven't used any Futaba servos on any of my other machines before. So I'll see how it goes. I'm sure it's going to be a great servo, but anyways, that was the choice for my tail servo. The cyclic servos I went with is also a programmable servo from Futaba. It's the S9177SV, and on that same thread where I found the tail servo, those people who are going for speed setups on the TDR2 were mostly going for the BLS172SV or the BLS177SV. Both of those servos are exactly the same, except the BLS172SV has got a plastic top case and an aluminium body, and the BLS177SV has got an aluminium top case and an aluminium body. So they're exactly the same servo from what I read up. They use the same gears on the inside, they've got the same specifications, everything is exactly the same between those two servos. Both of them are brushless. And whilst researching those servos, I actually came across this S9177SV. I couldn't really find any reviews online. I didn't search for days, but my little search online didn't show much on this servo, except on the Futaba website. The actual specification of the servo is almost exactly the same as the BLS172 and 177SV. The only difference that I could find was that this is a brushed servo, so it uses a brushed motor on the inside versus the brushless on the other two. The second thing that is different is that this servo on 2S LiPo, or 7.4 volt as they rated, has got 41 kilograms of torque, whereas the BLS172 and 177SV has only got about 37 kilograms. So on paper, this servo is stronger, although the speed, which is 0.11 for 60 degrees a second, is exactly the same as the other two. So technically, their specifications are exactly the same. This one has got a little bit more torque. But now the other ones are brushless, and there's a whole thing about brushless versus brushed motors. I've read up the two most prominent advantages of brushless over brushed is that a brushless motor requires less maintenance because it has no brushes. There are extremely good pilots that posted that they've been using brushed servos for over 2,000 flights, and those servos still perform without a hitch. So after 2,000 flights, I'm a bit of a realist. I know that I will sadly put this machine into the ground before I reach 2,000 flights. So if I don't put it in 2,000 flights and the servos start deteriorating, I'm more than happy to replace them. I've got no issues. So the maintenance part for me isn't really something that bothers me. The second advantage of brushless motors are that they are more energy efficient. So they will use less power for the same amount of output as a brushed motor would. In essence, meaning less battery power gets consumed. On this machine, I highly doubt that your electronics battery power and how much more efficient a brushless versus a brushed motor is going to make any difference. These machines, the most power they get pulled is from the motor and the ESC. So to me personally, I don't have an issue. Every flight I'll put in a new battery, so if it uses more or less electricity, it doesn't matter to me. So I'm very excited about these, especially because there's so little posted online about them. I will probably come back and put a little review on the servos once I've flown the heli for the first time. But they are really good, they are programmable, so exactly the same as the other two servos, and it's half the price, which is what made me very excited. I could rather spend more money on battery packs or whatever I choose, but literally half the price of the other two servos where I live. Alright, so now let's actually get on with the build of part 2. I'm just going to grab my heli quick, and I just want to jump to that tail servo rack. So once the tail servo was mounted, Jan shows you at the end of the manual how to route the cable, and you've got a choice. Either it runs underneath this block over here on the outside and you cable tie it to here, or, which is shown over here, or you can actually feed it through there. I fed my cable through that block. It's going to be very hard to show you guys, but it actually goes into that block over there and then it comes out the other side. And what you will notice is I've split my signal cable ever so slightly. Hope it shows up. I've split my signal cable because that helped me actually get it through that hole, because that hole is really tiny and you can't put a servo cable through there. So if the 3 wires are like this and you split them up and you group them like this, then it actually feeds through the hole a lot easier. Anyway, so that's the way I routed my cable, and now I'm going to jump back to the actual part 2. These 2 pages are just an explanation of Jan's linear drive system. It's got actually nothing to do with the build, it just explains to you how his cyclic servos work instead of the normal little arms on the servo with the whole cyclic. Nice information, but it doesn't have much to do with the build at this stage. This part goes together quite easy. There's nothing to note here. There are little information marks where he says, you guys will notice if I go here, I circled because it says to not tighten these at this stage. You will come back and tighten and Loctite them a little bit later in the build. And I made notes because I didn't know if Jan actually remembered every single place. He said he does. This is not necessary. This was for me. So again, his manual is exceptional. He doesn't miss anything. Every single bolt that he says leave for later, he will tell you later on, Loctite it now, tighten it up properly, or whatever the case might be. Then you put together this part. Again, you just slide the rod through. There's nothing special about this. These bearings are press fitted into this, so nothing for you really to assemble. It goes together perfectly. This is your elevator push shaft, which controls your elevator. And this is already pre-assembled. There's nothing for you to do here. Then we get to the actual aileron and pitch control rods, and this was the one place where these shafts of mine looked like they were pitted, so the actual metal had tiny little holes in it, and it had this white powdery stuff which looks like it's busy oxidizing. Anyways, I sent a picture to Jan and he responded within a day asking me for my address, and he posted me a new set. So the service as well is excellent. Really happy with that. Anyways, so I've got my new shafts. This step of the assembly says to Loctite these, and you put this rod through and you give it a little bit of space so that it actually hangs above the carbon fiber. And the reason for that is you'll be putting a tension screw from this side in and from the other side, which actually has to push this rod in, and if it's stuck right against the carbon fiber, it won't actually be pushed in properly. So I read online from another thread that you shouldn't actually Loctite this at this stage, because this rack over here needs to be aligned with the servo wheel, and those teeth needs to be aligned exactly with this little slots, with the middle one which is right in the middle of this ball on the other side. And it's much easier if you don't have the screw in here and you don't have the shaft, and this whole thing in essence is not there. Then you put the servos in from the front. Those little gear wheels are in exact position they're supposed to be. And then you take this rack and you just lie it on perfectly and you slide the shaft through it and it grabs into the rack and you push it through and you push it to the correct height, and then only you Loctite that bolt. I will show you guys when I get to that step, but that's in essence the explanation of why it's easier to do this a little bit later rather than at this stage. But this will work. It's just going to be very hard to hold those two in the correct position and then slide in the aileron and pitch servo from the front. Something to keep in mind, the tip I read somewhere worked well for me. So these little things, this is where the grub screw will go in that pushes that shaft inwards to make sure that it's held tight against the servo wheel. Jan says to use CA. I don't believe in CA anymore on my helis. I've got an 800 machine where the manual says that you need to build the push rod with CA, and I did that. The CA came loose a few months after the build, and I literally had to buy a new kit for the heli. It was completely destroyed. Was doing a half pyro, tail pulled out, and I completely lost control of the heli, and that was because I used CA and not epoxy. So what I use now is the 2-part epoxy, so you've got an A, a B, or a 1 and a 2-part, and you squeeze out a little bit of the tube and you mix it. Hasn't failed me yet, so anyways, that's what I used. I just put epoxy here and I slid that down and I left it there till it dried out. The only thing you need to make sure is that if these shafts are pushed in from the top, that they don't, this little thing isn't skew and it has to wedge in there. It has to be perfectly so that it can sit in between, so that when you put in the screw, you don't actually push the thing against one side, but it actually just hangs and gets pushed into the middle. Yeah, anyways, nothing special. Again, I just epoxy instead of CA for me. This is your elevator servo. These little rubber dampeners that come with the servo has got little metal sleeves. Jan says don't use those because this and this part over here will compress that rubber, and if the sleeve is in between it will interfere with that. So it does say it in there, just don't use the metal sleeves, but otherwise nothing special. This comes pre-assembled, you literally just tighten it into the heli, nothing to do here. And this comes press-fitted into that cap. You just put this wheel on the servo. The only thing is that he does mention here, it is an extremely tight fit, and it is very, very, very tight. I need to emphasize that because this wheel really sits tightly on this output shaft of the servo. So before you push it down all the way, just make sure that you've got it seated properly, because those output shafts have these little ridges. And that little wheel has got little slots on the inside, which obviously needs to line up, but just make sure that you've got it properly. So wiggle a little bit until you feel, and then push it in properly, but it sits really, really tight on there. So there you mount your elevator servo into your mainframe. What is really clever is that obviously these brackets over here are tightened on this side, but the belt has got the belt will pull on the servo, and then what Jan does is on the other side you actually have this screw that goes into this cap, and what that means is the whole servo on both sides is held rigid, so there's no way for it to move or twist or torque, this is quite clever for me. Anyways, he says do not use Loctite on the screw, because if you do, when you unscrew it, remember this cap sits on a bearing and it can swivel, and you will never be able to get that screw off. Never say never, but you will have an incredibly hard time if you've Loctited this bolt into that cap, because there's nothing that holds this cap except the frame, and if the Loctite is settled, it's just going to swivel over here and you won't be able to get it out. So no Loctite on here, but it says here under no circumstances use it, so eat the ball. Here you just put tension on your belt, you use your index finger, you just hold the frame, you pull it up, and then you tighten that screw. My belt over here is extremely tight, it works like a charm. So, and here you just mount the carbon fiber plate on the servo. This is where your flybarless will actually be sitting. Now we get to the stage where the aileron and the pitch servo are actually set up properly. You didn't have to do it with the elevator servo. There's a reason for it. I'm not going to go too much into it. It is in the manual, but these two servos you need to be incredibly accurate with. And what you need to do is put the two servos, get them in a neutral position, not even on the flybarless controller, be it a V-Bar Neo or a Brain, whichever one you choose, and one of the others out there. Long story short, you connect your servos directly to your receiver and you put it in neutral. Then you take these two servo wheels and you put them on and you align those teeth and make sure that they are perfectly straight in a straight line. If they're not, you actually take this wheel and you move it one click. There's no real need to actually do a sub trim on the servo, because between the amount of teeth around here and the amount of ridges on the inside which sits on the output shaft, you can get an extremely accurate fit with those teeth. You can use sub trim, however, I got mine incredibly close to perfect, so there wasn't any need for me to give any. Then the second step is that you move one of the servos full to one direction, and that tooth over there will actually go 1, 2, 3 more or less and sit over there. If you have a programmable servo, you then increase the travel until it hits there, which gives you about 55 degrees of travel. Now, that's where the Futaba programmable servos are brilliant. Jan mentions here, though, that it needs to be 125%. It wasn't for me. For me, it was about 109.8%. So if I actually go here, you see he'll say for Futaba servos, the travel is to be set to 125%. It wasn't for me. I've seen other guys post online that it wasn't for them either. So long story short, just have a look at it. I just took a ruler and I held it on that tooth, and then I moved the servo and I adjusted the travel until it hit that point perfectly. Then what you do is you just plug in the other servo. So if this is the pitch servo, you plug in the aileron servo, you just adjust it to the same value, and you plug in your elevator servo and you just adjust it to the same value. Anyways, but if this setup is perfect, then there is almost no setup to be done in your flybarless controller once you get to that stage to get your swash level. We'll still get to it in this part of the build series, but this is such a clever way of setting it up, and if we move on, then you'll see why everything works out so well. So at this stage, this is the section I was talking about earlier, where if you put in the aileron and pitch servos, you need to line them up with the middle tooth on these racks, and it's going to get hard because they obviously slide freely around here, and then they can swivel because there's nothing holding them in that position. They can actually swivel. They need to be seated on these to be in a position where they don't swivel anymore. So if this was not here and these were in neutral position, you'd literally just push them in and tighten them up with these 8 screws over here. And once they're tightened, you'd actually take one of these racks, just lay it on the servo and make sure that that middle tooth lines up with that gear tooth over there, and then just push the shaft in from the top, make sure it's pulled away a little bit from the bottom, and put in your grub screw with some Loctite. So that's why I mentioned earlier it's a lot easier if you don't Loctite it earlier in the build. But yeah, you choose whichever way you want. I found it easier using the tip that I read online. So over here, Jan just shows, just make sure that those wheels do not come close to your main gear, because that will not be good, and that will be dependent on the spacing over here. If this happens, there are spacers that you can add, and they are included in the kit, so just be careful of that spacing. Over here, he's just saying that you need to loosen up these 2 screws and turn this gear until it's in the correct position. What happens is you're going to put on your swash, and then you're going to put through your elevated push rod, and it's going to drop through the bottom. And when it gets to the exact middle position, these screws need to point outwards. And the reason is that you can get your hex drivers in there, because if these bolts are now pointing to the bottom, there's no way for you to access them. If this is not the case, then you pull that rack back up to the top. This is the bottom view. So the rod will be pulled back up to the top. You then move this little wheel by hand, and then you put the rack back in again until it eventually gets to this position. And once it gets into this position, you Loctite them and you tighten them up. So if I just grab my machine quickly, I will show you if my elevator servo is more or less in the middle. Come on. You can see over there, the bolts are easily accessible. I can come in with a tool and I can easily access them. Alright, so that's just the intent of this whole step over here. One page back. It's just to make sure that you finally got access to those when the swash is in the neutral position. Okay, so then these two screws are used to put tension on this little wheel and the elevator shaft pusher on. If my screws were completely screwed out, this would already be putting tension on this. I don't know if that's the intent, but yes, mine was already tight, so I only did like one turn on each of these and made sure the Loctite grabbed properly. Because otherwise, if you tighten this too much, this thing won't want to move. Jan mentions here that it should be tight, but it shouldn't be that tight that it doesn't want to move. And then he also just mentions that if you ever remove your elevator rack, that you must always make sure that you check the clamping procedure, that everything is clamped properly here, because it would be disastrous if that shaft was able to move away from that gear wheel, because then you'd lose control of your elevator. And in this step over here, this is your swash leveling tool included in the kit. What Jan is saying is that you put it in and you lower your swash and you check that all of these sides are touching the swash leveling tool, and these racks should be at 19 millimeters. If they're not, you use this to adjust until that touches the swash leveling tool and that ball link over there can clip in, and that measurement is 19. If that is the case on all three sides, you've got a perfectly level swash. So no setup, because remember now the wheels on the servos went through that whole setup, and then we made sure that these racks were put perfectly on top of them in the correct position. And now we're making sure that from there to there, that is perfectly level on the swash leveling tool. So after this step is done, there is nothing for you to do in the flyballers. Your swash plate will be dead level. And I was actually, when you get to this step, you're actually shocked at how well everything works out, and you get that swash so perfectly level. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the second part of my build series. I'm still really enjoying the build. It goes so quickly. The reason why I'm taking so long is obviously I had to get my electronics. Put quite a bit of effort into research, but the more constricting factor was that I couldn't buy them at this stage. What I still need at this stage is, because I've gone with the V-Bar Neo. The reason for it is there's geometry correction because of the servo arms that travel in a radius rather than in a straight line, as is the case with this linear drive system. And all of the flybarlesses, from what I've read up, has automatic geometry correction for that. The V-Bar though is the only one where you have a setting that you can say do not use the geometry correction calculations or whatever they do on the inside. So you can turn it off with the V-Bar, and they actually tell you to turn it off. That's why Jan advises you to use the V-Bar Neo. I still need to get a motor and my main blades and my battery packs. Battery packs is not an issue for me, the blades and the motor is though. I've kind of decided on my motor, it will be an X-Nova 50XX 530 kV motor, and I'm going to run it on I think it was the 20-tooth pinion for my speed setup. But anyways, next time I come back I'll be on the tail bull part, and hopefully that will be quite soon, seeing as I've got all of the stuff that is required for this section of the build, and then it will just be the last part, which is putting my motors and stuff in. Thank you guys for joining. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Cheers for now.